Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your current spot on the globe. And welcome to this discussion on the state of America's community of Russia watchers. I'm George Beebe, Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest, as well as one of those Russia watchers that we'll be discussing today. Before I get into introductions, I should probably begin by doing that political sciencey thing of defining our terms. So I want to say what I mean when I use that term Russia watcher. What I mean is America's Russia experts who are in government, academia, think tanks, and journalism who look at what's going on inside Russia domestically and at Russia's external or foreign policy behavior. What I don't mean are specialists that look at other aspects of Russia that aren't related, or at least not directly related, to public policy matters. So people who are expert in Russian art history, for example, very interesting field, but I'm not including them in our discussion today about Russia watchers. So let me move on now to introduce our panel. Anatol Lieven is a professor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service in Qatar and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. Anna Vassileva is head of the Russia Studies program and director of the Graduate Initiative in Russia Studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies in California. Keith Gessen is the George T. Delacorte Assistant Professor of Magazine Journalism at Columbia University. And finally, Michael Kimmage is Professor of History at the Catholic University of America and a former staff member of the State Department's policy planning staff, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio from 2014 to 2016. This is what I regard as truly an all-star roster of panelists, and one that not coincidentally covers all of those sectors that I mentioned, government, academia, think tanks, and journalism. I should say a few words about the ground rules for today. There aren't many. For the panelists, the one thing I don't want you to do is to engage in ad hominem attacks on any members of the Russia watcher community by name. I also want you to be as candid as possible and feel free to question and challenge each other and me for that matter. For the audience, we're going to jump right into questions and answers rather than asking our panelists to make any opening statements. So all of you should feel free to use that question icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and start sending questions in as soon as you feel moved. I'm going to get the session started today with a question of my own, and I'm going to introduce that question with a little bit of a dirty trick, and that is to drag out something that one of our panelists, Anatol Lieven, wrote 15 years ago in the New York Times about America's Russia watchers. After pointing out that one of the most obvious duties of any foreign policy analyst is to be able to see things from the point of view of our rivals abroad, he wrote, and I quote, "Only a small proportion of analysts of Russia are capable of walking even a few yards in Russian shoes. In consequence, American assumptions have tended to swing wildly between a naively optimistic belief that Russians can quickly be turned into American-style Democrats and a crudely pessimistic, even racist belief that Russians are incorrigibly authoritarian and expansionist," end quote. So I regarded that as quite a sharp indictment of America's Russia watchers. And Anatol, lest you wonder whether anything you write ever has an impact on what goes on inside the closed quarters of government, I should tell you that I was at the time overseeing CIA's cadre of Russia analysts. And I cut out your article and highlighted those sentences and taped it to my door. So it certainly had an impact on me, and I can't say for sure whether it had an impact on anyone else there. But I'm saying all this to tell you that I'd like each of you to begin today by offering your assessment of the current health of America's community of Russia watchers. What do you think its strengths and weaknesses are? How effective do you regard it in informing public policy and public discourse? And because you're all professors, I'd like you each to offer a letter grade for the community, A, B, C, D, or F, using the American grade system, and explain your reasoning for your evaluation. So Anatol, let's begin with you.
Well, I'm afraid I would give the community as a whole, by the way, in which I include myself, you know, I'm not judging this from outside. And obviously there are great exceptions represented on this panel, but on the whole, I would give them a D, not just in terms of the analysis, but also, frankly, in terms of the policies that have resulted from this analysis. And I think that what this reflects is a number of different things. I mean, one is that too many branches of academia who are experts in their own way, I'm thinking of historians of Russia, sociologists of Russia, have not involved themselves in the policy debate. There are strong prejudices against this in academia. This is a pity because, of course, so many of the prejudices against Russia that exist are historically rooted. And so, you know, it is the task of historians, in part, to dispel those. Certainly, there has been, I think, you know, all these years on since I wrote that New York Times piece, alas, among too many of the observers, no great progress or even a retreat in terms of ability to see the world through the eyes of the Russians. Now, it should be said that this ability, you know, does not in and itself mean sympathy with the Russians. You know, George Kennan obviously was one of the greatest, you know, analysts, most knowledgeable people about the Stalinist system in Russia, which led him to the conclusion that this, you know, the Stalinist Soviet Union had to be combated and contained. One can understand another system and decide that it has to be fought. But I would say that what this ability, which by the way, Hans Morgenthau, the great realist philosopher, laid down as a fundamental ethical duty of the statesman and diplomat, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of rivals. What it does do is it allows you to identify what the other side sees as its truly vital interests, interests on which it will not compromise, just as you will not compromise on your vital interests, and what it sees as secondary interests on which it will compromise. And that, of course, allows you to identify when another country has to be combated. It allows you to identify when compromise is possible. And it also, of course, allows you to see what are the issues for which you, in the last resort, will really fight or will make great sacrifices, and which are not. And I think the failure to do that has led to multiple failures in American policy. On the one hand, it led to an underestimation of Russia's determination to resist NATO expansion in Georgia and Ukraine, with pretty tragic consequences for the Georgians and Ukrainians. On the other hand, the failure to understand where the Russians were coming from, stemming in part from a degree of self-righteousness, which meant that people could not see that actually where the Russians were coming from was very like where we were coming from, made it impossible to seek reasonable accommodations and indeed cooperations in Syria. So I'm afraid that I am not very positive about the state of the field.
Thank you, Anatol. Anna, where are you coming down in your grading?
Oh, grading is difficult in graduate schools these days, as you know. Even B is a drama. But let me be a little more merciful than Anatol here, and probably not a D, because there is enthusiasm, and I see faculty as victims more than perpetrators often. I am probably the only one of you who lived and worked. I started to teach at the university in Irkutsk before coming to the United States to teach 30 years ago. So I remember very well that One could not publish an article, no matter what topic, without mentioning Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and Lenin. And it would also be the beginning and the end. And it's so strange. Often I say I left the Soviet Union and I came to the Soviet Union 30 years later, because I cannot see Russian scholarship these days without either bashing Putin in one way or another, or without exposing, exhibiting one's virtue as a great Democrat and someone who sides with the great democratic values, things that should not be a part of the academia. So that's one. The feeling of the discourse by ideology and the groupthink is, I believe, one of the major threats to academic freedom. And that's something that we cannot give away, no matter what we are expected to say, no matter what would be published or not published. And this is where I really feel many of my colleagues are getting kind of carried away by their emotional discourse, the rejection of Putinism, and turning Russia into the Putin land rather than Russia, a country that's complex. Again, the people who are here in the audience or, my colleagues at the panel all realize the complexity of what's happening in Russia, yet this propensity to depict it in black and white terms really is harming our ability to think and to be pragmatic in the analysis. So one of the issues, one of the reasons why I would give a low grade of C is the over-specialization, which is killing the field, I believe. The not just reliance, but demand of quantitative dominance. A human being cannot be calculated. That's why it's a human being. It's not a machine. It's not an algorithm yet. But the emphasis at the departments on taking advantage of quantitative methodology, and approaches, as if that could substitute analysis of human behavior and the change of that behavior, is extremely detrimental, in my opinion. The third point is, again, because of this over-specialization, we lose track, and our students often lose track of why do they study Russia? To get a diploma, to get a job? Where is the big overarching issue of war and peace? Are we teaching them for peace or are we teaching them for war? And if we're teaching them for war, and that's what we're teaching them for, because again, as Anatol said, we don't need to condone, we don't need to accept, we don't need to justify, we're trying to understand. And in order to understand, we need to know, to get into those Russian shoes. So, and then we would have to determine, are we teaching our students to live in peace? And then we have to make compromises. And then we have to revive diplomacy, which is being killed by ideology now. Where is the role of diplomacy? We're not teaching them properly for that. Or if we're teaching them for war, let's build nuclear shelters. Why is the issue of possibility of nuclear accident, catastrophe is not on the agenda anywhere? And the last one, and we can talk about it more, for me, the fourth point that is very important, when we look at the history of philosophy, we look at philosophy defining the difference between a human being and an animal. What makes us different from animals? The question of the 21st century is what makes us different from a computer? And for that difference, we need to know Russian culture and Russian history. We need to know that whole legacy of human civilization in order to be able to preserve this civilization in, with the rise of artificial intelligence, computerization, and all this onslaught of technology. And this is where knowing more than, Putin's history or Putin's ideology is vital for the United States of America. So these are the 4 points that I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, so we've gone from D to C. Keith, where do you come down on this?
Just a little bit of background as to why I'm on this panel. I've spent the last 3 years interviewing Russia hands, which I define a little bit more narrowly than George has defined them. A Russia hand for me is somebody who has served in a Russia analysis or policy position in government, even if it was a short stint or a fellowship. Once you've been inside, I consider you a Russia hand. It's a little bit narrower. And I've been interviewing them to find out who they are, how they think, how they formulate their ideas about Russia. And so my kind of preliminary, and I want to say I'm very honored to be on this panel, having been an attendee many times and learned a great deal at panels like this. My kind of preliminary diagnosis is that, I don't know, there's a lot of knowledge. And in terms of kind of individual Russia hands, I was really impressed by the level of expertise that I think, as a kind of layperson who has not spent a lot of time in DC or around government, I was, frankly, I was shocked at the level of the high level of expertise in the Russia hands cohort. So I would give that A minus. The kind of the level of public discourse around Russia, I would give an F. Right? I mean, and as they say on Yelp, only because there's no lower grade. Right? If I could, yeah. So, and just to kind of give like a very quick summary of what I learned. I mean, the cohort is, I think one of the most striking aspects of the cohort of Russia hands in DC is that it's quite small. There are kind of clear historical reasons for this. There's 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The US government needs to now think about 15 separate republics. It needs to staff those embassies. And so suddenly you have a kind of dispersal of the people who might, in a different generation, in the previous generation, would have been working on the Soviet Union, now are working on different republics inside the Soviet Union. It's kind of a historical irony. Stalin wanted all the republics seated at the UN, right? And now, post-91, they are. So, and the people who go to them emerge with a different kind of expertise and also a different kind of perspective on Russia, right? A valid perspective, a valuable perspective, but perhaps one that in the end, it does not necessarily serve kind of American strategic thinking very well. The other thing that happened, obviously, is September 11th, 2001. So again, a kind of shift of emphasis inside the US government and outside of it, away from Europe and Russia specifically. And then you have, so those are kind of clear reasons why the cohort has shrunk. In recent years, you have a kind of pendulum swinging in the other direction, with Russia reasserting itself on the world stage. I think there's greater interest in Russia. For me, the kind of big question has remained why the conversation in DC is so much narrower than the conversation that we have in academia about Russia, or even in kind of journalistic circles about Russia. It feels like the sort of window for discussion is quite a bit narrower. One of the things that has been a kind of mystery to me, and something that I learned while talking to people, is that the left, which used to be, was never very powerful in Washington, has kind of lost interest in Russia as a topic of passion and discussion. So where Bernie Sanders, presidential candidate whom I supported, was willing to say nice things about Cuba and their medical system during the primaries, for better and worse, was not really interested in changing the terms of the debate around Russia, and in fact wanted to be quite quite tough on Putin, which to me was disappointing. So we have a kind of shrinking of the cohort, a disappearance of the left in terms of their kind of interest and willingness to engage in this debate. We also have the kind of crazy historical circumstance of the Russian interference in the election and a kind of switch of the typical sort of party polarity or party positions on Russia, where now the Republicans want to be softer on Russia and the Democrats need to show that they are tough on Russia because of the election interference. So you have a lot of kind of interesting historical contingencies that have contributed to a kind of a really poor public discourse and a cohort that is both smaller and I think ideologically narrower than it ought to be. I'll stop there.
All right, very good. Michael, where do you come?
Well, dubiously, perhaps I'll give the highest grade of a B-, but I'll focus my comments only on the DC expert community, sort of think tankers and such, and we'll make 2 points which echo some of what Anna and Anatol and Keith have already said. The first point is about Russian foreign policy, which seems to be something that we, speaking in the first person plural about Russia watchers, seem to really struggle with. There's lots of attention paid to Putin, of course, now to kleptocracy, disinformation, military capabilities, energy, but foreign policy stems from history. And in that sense, what we seem to fail to understand or to think through is the way in which the relationship between the Kremlin and the Russian populace creates Russian foreign policy. It's a much more complicated subject than what Putin's particular agendas might be, and that there is a Russian diplomatic style which now goes back centuries with lots of evolutions and changes along the way, but deserves its own kind of discrete attention. To go back to Kennan, whose name has already come up, I think a real interest in Russian foreign policy is implicit both to the X article and to the long telegram, with some reference to history and to sort of how Russian foreign policy is formed or was formed in the Soviet Union. And I think that we really struggle on this account and tend, predictions are difficult, but the track record is not good in terms of predictions. We tend to impute, this has already been said, but let me emphasize the point, we tend to impute motives to Russia that stem from our own worldview. And so you get the very commonly made argument in Washington, D.C. that Putin betrays Russia's true interests. Well, who's to say what Russia's true interests are? It's not Putin alone, but I'm not quite sure it's a group of people quite far away from the country who tend to have an American paradigm for how the world functions. And that seems convoluted and quite probably wrong, but is a sort of often heard operating assumption. It just, I think, speaks to a lack of intellectual curiosity about foreign policy, which can have quite severe, perhaps even deadly implications for policy formation. The second point I would make is about culture. And, again, thinking of the expert community in DC, I think that there's almost no awareness of what Russian culture is since 1991. I'm sure people have read the great Russian writers at some point and have a kind of graduate school memory of some of these topics, but not an engagement with what's been happening more recently. This seems very different from the Cold War, when culture was one of the battlefields. And so you were obligated to pay attention to Pasternak if you were a policymaker or an expert in the 50s and 60s. And I can't think of anything comparable. We tend not to take in the theater scene in Petersburg and Moscow, or novels or things that are being produced in Russia, but those are great windows into whatever Russian identity is. And identity flows very directly into foreign policy. So I think we cut ourselves off from those kinds of sources and then speculate on a very thin evidentiary basis about what's going on and what will happen, which is my sort of concluding point, is an irony, because Russian culture was much more difficult to piece together in Soviet times, when, as Anna said at the beginning of her comments, there was a sort of rigidly imposed official ideology, and you had to look in the crevices and in the cracks to find the real culture. Now that's really not the case. It's out there in the open. In a media age, internet age, we sort of have access to it in theory, but we don't engage with it. And so I think that that's a very unfortunate failure and results in sort of Russia watching with a much too pronounced American accent. That's the final point I would make.
All right. Thank you all. So we've got grades ranging from a B- to a D, and I'm not sure whether to evaluate those grades on the inflated scale that's so common today in our universities.
I should perhaps say that, I mean, I was talking about Russia watchers in a much broader way than Keith was.
Yeah.
So I was bringing in the journalists who write about Russia, not necessarily exclusively about Russia, but who regard Russia as one of their main areas of expertise, and as well as obviously the think tank people and so on.
Right, which is exactly what I asked you to do. And Keith, I don't want to speak to you, but my guess is you'd give a much higher grade to the Russia hands in government, that small group, than you would to the broader community, including all of the people involved in our public discourse. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, they're hard to separate, right? Something that you said when we were preparing for this, which I thought was really interesting, was that when you're inside government, it's hard to get away from what is being discussed in public, right? That it's not a separate world, and that's really interesting to me. I mean, I always thought of government as being quite separate, and the people in the CIA being quite sequestered. But the more I sort of talk to people, the more I see that the public discourse actually has a profound effect in all sorts of ways on what is happening inside government. I think those of us who are in public ought to be cognizant of that.
No, that was exactly my experience, and I don't think my experience was at all unique. What goes on in the broader public discourse on these issues has a profound impact on what's possible inside government itself. In part because what's possible inside government is a function of politics. Certain things are simply, ruled out, and the popular discourse on these matters shapes those political possibilities, and it shapes the environment in which those government experts have to operate. So it's very hard to separate these worlds.
Let me just also add here, George, I mean, as probably you've understood from my contribution here, I was speaking from the point of view of watching the role of education and academia in raising the cadres of those who go into government agencies and the government. And I can't emphasize enough how, number one, education is important. Number two, current education in Russian studies needs to be upgraded. It needs to be taken into the new paradigm of the 21st century. Because willingly or unwillingly, the faculty imposes still the paradigm of the 20th century, which is not a canon's paradigm. As you all know, before Mr. Kelly, who was a canon supervisor at the State Department, even allowed him to go into political analysis, Cannon and his peers had to study the whole program of the Russian pre-revolutionary gymnasium, starting from the first grade to the last grade, all the subjects, so that they can think like Russians. He had to master Russian language, and only then they were allowed to, to play with politics. And so what we see now is often 3 or 4 courses, and that's a limit, of academia. And as I said, the emphasis on on quantifying things, really makes academia irrelevant very often. That's why there are so few of of people from academia who really go into the government, as well as this ideological kind of approach. So not only we need to bring our students into the 21st century paradigm by giving them fundamental education that includes absolute fluency in Russian language and knowledge of culture and history, but we also need to start thinking with our students, what can we do together with the Russians? For example, climate change challenge. Are we preparing our students to understand, the science, how the scientists are working in Russia, how we could work together facing global issues? And to me, that's the 21st century paradigm. And when we don't educate students that way, they go into the government, they go into government agencies, 10, 15 years, they will become these Russia watchers in Washington who are determining policy or influencing the politicians, and that's we will drag the old approaches into the new reality that can turn out quite tragic. If something happens that's beyond our control, which can happen with cyber these days.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you've begun to transition from diagnosis to prescription and all of this, and talk a little bit about what needs to be done to improve our performance in Russia watching, let me throw that question out explicitly to the rest of the panel. What kinds of steps do we need to take to get better in this area? Anatol?
I mean, I'd like to echo, what Anna has said. This, of course, also reflects the decline of area studies. It's a tragic paradox, in many ways, that just as the former Soviet Union opened up, became much, much easier to study, much easier to travel in, so the study of it, in its own terms, declined radically. But this, of course, is true much more widely as well. I think that the United States and other countries as well, as a matter of policy, needs to put much more financial support into the area of area studies, but not the way we saw it after 9/11 in the Muslim world, where huge sums of money went to repetitive, very narrow studies of extremism and terrorism. I saw this so much in the case of Pakistan and Afghanistan, without fostering the knowledge of the societies from which these movements came, which were actually necessary to allow you to begin to understand them. And from that point of view, absolutely like to echo what people have said about a knowledge of Russian history. Because, I mean, something I found in all the countries that I've worked in, at least all of those which basically have a role in international affairs. And I think this is very true of Washington as well, of course, as maybe, well, I'd like to know your views. But foreign and security establishments have a way of developing doctrines derived from history or their perception of history. Doctrines about the permanent interests of their country, doctrines about the identities of their country, what is allowable for them to think, what isn't. These are not the creation, as Michael said, of one man. This is not Putin. This is the view of the Russian establishment derived from Russian history and a sense in that establishment of Russian interests. And this can be studied. It's not, that there are some movements in the world. To understand where they're coming from requires enormous leaps of imagination and study, like, the Taliban. It's generally pretty difficult to get inside their heads. I don't think that actually with, sufficient research and knowledge, it is that difficult to get inside the heads of the Russian establishment. But I would say that, and here I'm of course echoing a long series of realist thinkers, including Kennan and Morgenthau and Niebuhr and others, what you absolutely have to shelve before trying to do that is self-righteousness. It is quite impossible, to develop a sense of where other people are coming from if you depart from the standpoint that you are good and anyone who disagrees with you is bad, and basically that's the end of the story. That is a terrible guide to trying to understand other countries.
If I could jump in, George, I would just make a few quick points. One, the Russia watching community has a tendency to replicate itself. I'm not quite sure why. Perhaps, Keith, you can explain this in the book when you publish it, but that's very unfortunate given how unpalatable the status quo is and how much failure there is in previous US-Russia policy. So something is clearly not working. And the first thing I would urge upon us is not to replicate the status quo, to figure out some way of changing it. To echo Anatol's point, I think humility is a good point of departure and an acknowledgement, this goes far beyond the Russia file, but that the US really dictates far less than it did in the 1990s. And so you have to be more imaginative if you're sitting in Washington about how the world works, and be more accepting that there's these sort of multiple variables out there, some of which we can influence, some of which we can't, and sort of fit the U.S.-Russian relationship into this changing new world. And more practically for DC think tanks, and George, I know yours does this, but it's always shocking to me how few Russian voices are a part of it. It goes back to Keith's earlier point that you get lots of post-Soviet voices in these discussions, people from these countries, diplomats, experts, others, but the Russian voice is often inaudible. And that's sort of remarkable to me. So maybe people don't want to hear it. Maybe it's going to say annoying things. Maybe it will repeat sort of Kremlin talking points. That's all possible. But there's a need, I think, in DC to integrate those voices and simply to listen, and then perhaps disagree, but first to listen. But that's, in terms of precepts, that's where I can think of beginning this very difficult job ahead of us.
Yeah, and I would just echo and think about, there are generational changes that take place. This kind of new cohort has a new historical experience. One of the most powerful historical experiences for Russia hands is the disappointment of the 90s, the sense of betrayal, rightly or wrongly. That was a very powerful experience, and the kind of new generation has not had that experience, and they have a slightly different view. But one of the ways in which the generational kind of turnover is mitigated or stifled is institutionally, right? So I think something that I started thinking about a lot, and there's a kind of tendency in DC, which is curious, especially among think tankers, to really kind of denigrate the work of think tanks, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I talked to somebody at a think tank who said, oh, I write these long, boring papers. The real action is in government. And you can explain that in various ways psychologically. But I actually came to think that think tanks were quite important in terms of suggesting things to people inside government, in terms of dictating the kind of tenor of public conversation. And so I came to think that kind of new think tanks or new institutions where people with different perspectives can come to Washington from Anna's class, right? I mean, I'd be very curious to hear, Anna, if we have time for you to talk about what happens to your students when they come to DC. But my sense is that the kind of narrowing of the perspectives happens via the institutions. And what that suggests to me is that we might want more institutions representing a kind of broader array of views.
One of the things, just to offer my own comment here, that I noticed when I was inside of government is that the pace of activity is so intense. There's so much going on, so much driven by your inbox, by events in the world at any given time, that it's a real luxury to be able to step back and get broader perspective on things, and to think about our thinking, to think about the paradigms that we're using, very often unconsciously, for understanding these events. And one of the things that can help, I think, is in the world of academia, the world of journalism, the world of think tanks, you have more time, you have more of an ability to think about those paradigms, those models that we're using, the assumptions that underlie them, and expose those and offer some alternative ways of understanding things that can be of a great service to people that are in government, that are just, rushing from one event to another and responding oftentimes frantically to what's going on. So let me open up with some of the questions that are coming in. We've got quite a few ones now. I'll start with one from Jacob Heilbrunn, editor of the National Interest, who says that Michael Lind has predicted in a new essay in the National Interest that what he calls neo-McCarthyism regarding Russia, driven for now by the Democrats, will disappear if Biden wins the presidency. And he wonders, might the Republicans and Democrats reverse fields on relations with Russia, with conservatives starting to denounce Biden for being too dovish? And more broadly, how much of American policy toward Russia is based on what Russian experts think, and how much is it just crude partisanship? Thoughts? Who wants to start? Anatol.
What I have found is that, I mean, what has introduced a new element really was the reality, but even more the exaggerated perception of Russian interference in the 2016 elections and support for Trump. That shifted the debate into something even more, I would say, hysterical. But until then, I had seen, I must say, a great unity of views in the think tanks and belonging to or affiliated with or close to both the political parties. And I think one reason for that is that the policies which really laid the groundwork for relations with Russia and also the problems in relations with Russia after the end of the Cold War were completely bipartisan, especially NATO expansion, if you look at that. This was absolutely accepted by both political parties, initiated by the Clinton administration, followed by the Bush administration. And once you have a bipartisan consensus of that kind in Washington, of course there are critics, but they tend to be, shall we say, rather at the fringes, and they are not the kind of people who are going to move from think tanks into government, for example. So I do not think myself that, I don't think that the two parties will switch. I think that this basic consensus will continue. My own view is that what would shift that, what in my view should have shifted it a long time ago, is if, as Jill Barndollar wrote in a recent piece, if America really, really, really starts to concentrate on the main event, which is China. At that point, if America, if the American establishment really prioritizes China, then it's not so much that people will become more positive towards Russia, it's just that every other issue will be, in a sense, downgraded in importance, but also that simply people will not want to have other crises or to set up the potential for future crises that will be liable to distract America from the rivalry with China and potentially strengthen the Chinese. So that's what I would see as potentially changing the attitude to Russia in Washington. I don't think this is a party political thing in the long run.
Keith.
Oh, I guess I would just add to that, given what I know of Vice President Biden's Russia team, I don't expect them to be more dovish. I would welcome that, but I would be surprised. To answer the slightly broader question of how much of our policy toward Russia is kind of politically and driven or driven by partisans and how much is driven by experts, my observation is that there's a kind of there are two levels, right? And up to a certain level, there's a whole lot of stuff that really is kind of handled by experts that goes up to the level of kind of the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, or whatever the current geographic division is. So there's a lot of stuff, and if you look at the Ukraine crisis, that's actually a very good example of a situation that was mostly being handled, at that relatively high level, but not at the level of the president. And there's a kind of a bevy of issues that never rise to that level, and there the experts are very influential. And then once something is at the presidential level, is in public, is on the front page of the paper, then kind of politics takes over, right? So, and certain things, I think even NATO expansion is something that kind of bubbled up from the expert community and from a small cohort inside the National Security Council to the presidential level. So the experts do up to a point, up to a particular point in time, they are very important. So in that sense, I think it's worth thinking about the experts. But at a certain point, yes, they're pushed aside.
Two quick points I would make. Anna, please.
No, go ahead, Michael. I'll speak.
First, it's maybe not quite an answer to the question about the election and party politics, but I've just been struck by the utter absence of Russia from the 2020 election. It hasn't figured in the debates. Joe Biden had a piece in Foreign Affairs where he mentioned it, but it seems almost not to figure. I mean, there's the partisan strife around Hunter Biden's laptop and all of that, but I wouldn't equate that with a debate about Russia. It seems almost non-existent, and so maybe the question is, can we get a debate about Russia back into the public sphere? I'm not so optimistic at the moment about that. And then would just slightly modify Keith's excellent point, I think, about where the guild of experts is powerful on the sort of second tier issues. But you have the example in both the Obama and the Trump presidencies of somewhat more realist White Houses that are sort of embedded, not in a deep state, but a complicated government world in which Congress, State Department, Pentagon tend to be sort of reflect the more hardline Russia watching view. And who wins is sort of an interesting matter in the Ukraine crisis, other sort of issues. You see the president sort of losing out often in many cases in terms of at least stated agendas. Obama described himself as Scowcroftian, but it wasn't a Scowcroftian Russia policy that his administration produced. So, I think when you factor Congress in, you get even another layer of complexity and now a sort of a great anchor for any kind of different Russia policy because of sanctions.
I just would like to make a quick point. Thank you, Michael. But that would be related to what Anatol just said. China is obviously the biggest looming problem, minus possibility of nuclear catastrophe. That would be accidental. The only explanation that I can find for this total lack of pragmatism and strategic thinking in US foreign policy vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis Russia in respect to our Chinese policy is the fact that Russia has become the other. This is the only topic, really, this is the only topic that absolutely unifies both parties. I mean, you can see references to Putin that pop up in vice presidential debate, the same happened in 2016, that are absolutely irrelevant to what they're talking about. But the candidates feel so compelled to mention something about Putin or something about Russia in a negative way, again, to prop up their democratic virtue, their adherence to democratic values. And this is where the danger is to me. This, once it is glued as one bipartisan issue, where everybody seems to agree on, in general, on that level, on the high level, it is very difficult to change the discourse. We know how discourse can be changed, but because of our economic relationship with China, it's a more complex process than the one with Russia. And so again, the pragmatism, the knowledge, the discussion of how Russia's policy vis-a-vis Russia could be modified, being driven by US national security interest, is not happening and must happen. And for that, we need public intellectuals. If politicians are unable to do it, we need people like you. We need public intellectuals and we need educators who understand the importance and who are not afraid of being pragmatic, and being philosophical, and telling their students that they have to see the big picture and not to be afraid. Keith asked me about the program. I think one, particularly the summer program that I organize, where I allow people to think together. I invite the best experts. Most of you participated, and the Aristotelian model, when they can think together, not pump each other with the information that exists, but think about history, think about literature, think about important issues, and then they have each other after the program. It's not about information. It's about not being afraid to be a public intellectual. And that's the main purpose, where we have to move away from this ideological dominance into thinking, into strategizing.
Well, anytime you advocate that Washington do more thinking, I get a little nervous. But let me now pose a question from Simone Sarajian from Harvard's Belfer Center, who addresses this question to Anatol Lieven, but I'm going to throw it open to the whole panel. and add something of my own to this. He says, Professor Lieven, you've been attending the Valdai Club for many years. How has the quality of discussion by Russia experts attending that forum changed over the years? And what are your impressions of the latest Valdai Club that you just participated in? And I want to add to that a little bit of a twist, and that is to the degree that you're able. What is your impression of what Russian experts think of the quality of US-Russia watching? You know, they're seeing their country, events in their country discussed by American experts. What do they think of it? Any sense of those things? Please, Professor Lieven, let's start with you.
Well, I should say this year, of course, I attended the Valdai by Zoom, so I didn't get the sense that I have in other years of the community. I have to say that the number, I mean, both the sheer number of Russia experts has narrowed. I mean, there are just fewer of them who are I would regard as leading figures for reasons that we've discussed. And I would say more broadly, and by the way, this is absolutely true, not just of the United States, but of Europe as well, that to a certain extent, the Russians, and by this I mean not so much Russian officialdom, but Russians in think tanks, have, I wouldn't say given up on the Russia watching communities in the West, but from their point of view, they feel that they have been disappointed so often, misrepresented so often, not listened to so often, that a certain degree of cynicism or disappointment or even lack of interest has set in. And this is a pity because, obviously, well, I mean, as it is everywhere, at the higher political and official level, more so in Russia, sort of more closed and secretive establishment, of course, it is difficult to talk to people and get frank opinions. But as you all well know, there are now, a number of Russian think tanks and university departments, at least in Moscow, where you have people who are quite close to the establishment, in some cases are children or grandchildren of senior people in the establishment who do know a lot about what is going on, and who, can represent, essentially in a franker way, the views of the Russian establishment, but who are at the same time, highly intelligent and within certain limits, perfectly, frank and open people. And just to pick up something that I can't remember, was it you, George, said? Or was it Michael? I've been struck again and again and again in discussions in the West by the failure to invite these people to talk. I mean, the first thing, and this, by the way, is not just true of Russia. It's been true of other countries that I've observed as well. I mean, obviously, the first thing to do if you want to find out what people are thinking is ask them. And if, now, of course, you then have to check that against other things and against facts. And of course, you cannot simply take it at face value. But that is where you begin. You begin by asking people who you feel can credibly represent, the point of view of that establishment. And, well, when I could still go there, I met them every year at the Valdai, and that from that is largely comes my sense of where the Russian establishment is indeed coming from. You don't need to get inside Putin's head to have a broader sense of where, the Russian policy elites are coming from. Of course, he sits at the head of them, he shapes them profoundly. But as I think Anna said, there is this terrible tendency in the media. I used to be a journalist, but sometimes in policy circles or think tanks as well, everything comes back to Putin, 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 Putin. Just as, so many people have said, if Biden wins the next elections, we may be surprised by how relatively little changes in some aspects of American policy, not in others like climate change, but in some aspects. Well, similarly, assuming that the successor to Putin, whenever that is somebody from the Russian establishment and not an outsider, or even actually, if it is an outsider, but somebody who, like Navalny, considers themselves to be a Russian nationalist, one might be very surprised indeed to find that a lot of this wasn't about Putin at all.
George, I would just mention in this context, hard to speak in the name of the whole Russian foreign policy establishment, but a letter that was published a year or two ago by Andrei Kartunov, I think it was called Dear John. It was a letter to the Russia Watchers in which he was critical. And, for those of us who know Andrei Kartunov, he's it's the wrong word to describe him, but sort of a liberal in the context of Russian foreign policy debates. He's not, especially pro-Kremlin. But he was critical of two things for the Russia Watchers, and I think that this probably is shared by many foreign policy elites in Moscow and elsewhere. One, that there's sort of, let's defer everything until the day that democracy comes to Russia, which is, sort of the opposite of having a real-time policy. But the other is, sort of America policy works if Russia will surrender unconditionally, which is, simply not going to happen. It's not plausible. I mean, it's perhaps a bit of a caricature of how things are stated in Washington, but that was his criticism. And as far as I know, and maybe this is sort of a metaphor for what we're talking about, that letter was never answered. There was never a sort of a Dear Andre letter, this is how we think, and either this is where you're wrong, or we sort of take your point. It just sort of went unheard, which is unfortunately kind of emblematic.
Okay, a question from Eric Lohr, who says, are we having similar debates about India hands, Brazil hands, Germany hands, Britain hands, Iran, Turkey hands? Is there something orientalizing and peculiar about how we set Russia into its own category as such a foreign and strange place that we need a bevy of experts to translate it for our foreign policymakers? Or should we encourage the Russia hand model for all countries? Thoughts on this?
Well, I certainly wouldn't encourage, I worked in South Asia for many years, first as a journalist, then an analyst. I'm now based in the Middle East. Following on from something that Michael said, I wouldn't encourage the policy community dealing with Saudi Arabia to wait until Saudi Arabia becomes a democracy in order to shape policy towards that country. No, I don't think treating the way we analyze Russia as a model would be a good idea at all. And I do think, I've sometimes thought that perhaps the problem is rather in a way the opposite, that even people who are very supportive of India, who want a close US partnership with India, they are entirely willing to accept and recognize that India is a democracy, but as we see even more under Narendra Modi, a very different kind of democracy from the way at least America has understood itself in the past. Who knows for the future? Same thing with China, not a democracy, of course, but there's always been a certain recognition that China will always be different and specifically Chinese. I mean, obviously there was the hope that it would become more democratic, more open, etc., which it hasn't. I think to some extent part of the problem is that there is this instinctive expectation, which I hope Anna will forgive me for saying is to some extent encouraged by some Russian liberal intellectuals themselves, that the Russians really ought to be like us. They must be. Why aren't they like us? They are, after all, they claim to be Europeans, they must be like us. If they're not, then there must be something really irredeemably wicked and horrible about them. There is a certain willingness to allow Indians to be Indians and Chinese to be Chinese. I don't know about Brazil, I'm not an expert. Saudis, Saudis to be Saudis, which doesn't seem to apply to Russia. It diminishes what I think, once again, is essential to a moderately objective and balanced policy, which is to allow people to be themselves. And that relates to something that I think Michael said, which I saw again and again, and which is ridiculous, frankly, as well as being disastrous, which is American policymakers and officials and think tank people telling the Russians what their national interests are. You know, that, I mean, A, it's stupid, but B, it really, really doesn't go down well. But C, even more importantly, it totally befuddles us. Because, you know, when you cannot on that basis judge where the other side or analyze where the other side is coming from. If you think that you know their national interest better than they do, you are incapable of listening to them. And, you know, that has been a fundamental flaw, I think.
And just, I mean, and just to follow up on that, and the question, to go back to the question was, you know, should there be Russia hands? You know, is this a category of person who should exist? My answer is yes. And you know, one of the things that I learned when I was talking to Russia hands and seeing how they formulated their ideas, one of the strongest kind of predictors of what your attitude or thinking about Russia was going to be like, it was not young versus old, it was not Democrat versus Republican, it was, do you know Russian or not? And the people who knew Russian, not across the board, but they tended to be more sympathetic, tended to take a view that could at least explain Russian actions, versus people who did not know Russian, who tended on the whole to be quite dismissive of Russian aspirations and ideas. So, you know, should we have expertise about all these countries with people who, you know, study them and go there and know the language? I think the answer is yes.
Great. Another question from Daryl Staniford. He asks, if the advent of social media and diffuse formation of public opinion has changed the way that policy is formed, has the role of government experts in the creation of policy decreased? And thus the audience that Russia watchers must influence changed? More focus on Congress, media, business leaders, for example.
I would say maybe a little bit, but not fundamentally. It goes back to points that were raised earlier. There is a political climate out there. George, you've mentioned this, that this shapes conversations and analysis that's produced within government. But I don't think social media per se has altered that relationship of sort of expert to policymaker to decision maker. I think it still functions largely as it did in Kennan's day, although the government is of course much bigger and, you know, in a way more bureaucratic than it was in the 1940s and 50s. But I don't think social media as such has revolutionized policymaking. Maybe it's contributed to the noise that we all hear around us, and so it's a little bit harder to hear yourself think. Apparently Kennan used to go, when he was director of policy planning, to the Library of Congress, and he would sit in the silent carrel there for half the afternoon and he would write his memos. That's sort of inconceivable now for people who work in government, and surely that's to our detriment because of internet and email and social media and such. But I think it's not a huge factor.
And then Kennan would leave his cell phone, you know, at the office. I heard. It's very.
Well, this raises a broader question. You know, if we're living in the world of tweeting and instant reaction to events, how conducive is that to deep expertise and you know, thoughtful, well-considered analytic judgment?
Well, I mean, following on from something a couple of people have said about government, I really do think it's very important to have, you know, talking from, you know, as a result of talking with friends who've served in the NIC and NSC and you know, academics who've gone into the State Department, it's terribly important to have a few people who are not required to respond to the immediate news. Partly because something I've heard again and again, I don't know if you gentlemen who've actually been in government would confirm this, that a lot of the time it is basically reproducing things that have been said 30 times before and putting a new top on them because of the latest thing that's been, in terms of an attempt at deep analysis of another country's policies. Especially, you know, if you're now responding to tweets, God help us, This is terribly destructive of the ability to sit back and think deeply about, another country or where it's coming from. So we need, if you like, I mean, Andy Marshall was unique, but we need, more people with the spirit of Andy Marshall who will actually be, to an extent, insulated from that and simply tasked with looking more deeply into places and looking to the future, and not writing yet another memo by, for the Assistant Secretary of State by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when quite often you could just say, look up what was said, in a memo 5 years ago on this subject. Don't ask me to write about it again. I think if you did that, you probably wouldn't be in your job for very long, but that's probably very often what, in fact, people ought to say.
If I could jump in just for a moment with a sort of secondary point about social media and Russia watchers, and I think that this goes back to the Arab Spring and mistakes that we've been consistently making for the last 5-10 years. Social media allows you to sort of follow who you think is interesting, and it really skews a portrait of a country toward the reformers. You saw this in Egypt, you saw it in a number of Arab Spring situations. So Belarus now, I get the impression that Russia watchers are responding almost exclusively to Twitter, which is produced almost exclusively by reformers. And so there's no understanding of what makes the police loyal to the government to the extent that it is. There's no understanding of Lukashenko's base of support, which is not non-existent. And so social media in that sense is sort of seductive. It sort of implies changes that are of course happening, that are real, but they may be in scale sort of much smaller than we seem. And so it's living in the moment to a degree, but I think our sources of information have now become in some ways, sort of bent out of proportion to our detriment as analysts.
All right, we have a question from Michael Vlahos of Johns Hopkins University, who says American exceptionalism, like Britannic exceptionalism in the 19th century, might be the decisive issue in the absence of empathy. How might we begin to bring elites to understand this deep cultural barrier? Reactions?
Well, let me just say that again, as an educator, I would say education is the most important thing. We don't talk to each other. So many of the decision makers who are sitting, in decision-making chairs do not know the language. How can you be an analyst, deep, sensitive, pragmatic analyst on a country like Russia without knowing the language? And I know I'll probably offend many people by saying this, but without knowing the language well, without knowing history, without understanding culture. I mean, there are some building blocks, foundational blocks that are essential. So education to me is the key. Again, we are not educating activists. It's really important to have a civic position and the principles and know what we need to defend and what we need to protect. But at the same time, academic freedom is academic freedom. Nobody canceled it. And so education, when we invite not just liberals, but also people who maybe we don't want to hear, people, not necessarily even государственники, but people like Dugin, let's have a debate. Let's teach our students how to learn from people who think differently and how to come to some understanding by building up the discourse. This is not happening. So we really have to think seriously about education, and we're trying to do some things, some inroads. That's number one. Number two is, and Russians are partially to blame for that themselves, is that we don't have enough students going to Russia. We don't have enough student exchanges. Our students, our cream of the crop students must go to Russia and live there, not for a week, and conduct research, travel. And this happens very little. The market is there. We have, fellowships or scholarships that we give grants for research and travel in Russia. And the students write to us when they see it on a graduate initiative on Russian Studies website and ask, can we go? Would you fund us? There is a tremendous demand. They want to go. There's no funding. This is where we come to government's interest, US government's interest in funding such, penetration, intellectual penetration of Russian contemporary Russian realities, as a follow-up, the kind of a classical training, here and there. And it's not just students, but communities of young policymakers, young officers, the rising experts, so that they talk to each other and understand each other better. So that comes to the fundamental issue. We don't want to listen to the other. We don't want to hear. And that has to be changed.
How do you change that? Sorry, just a quick reaction here. How do you change that situation when you're in an atmosphere where students that go over and spend a lot of time in Russia fear that they will be regarded as intelligence threats by their own government as a result of those contacts, and subject to criticism for being soft on Russia or fifth columnists back here in the United States? Those are, as far as I can tell, fairly significant obstacles to overcome if we're going to move in the direction you're suggesting. How do we address that?
Well, they are significant, but again, that's why there are two components here. The public intellectuals have to, stir up this discourse that, we weaken ourselves. We appear as weak, non-trusting community, if we are prepared to label students who go to another country and study there as potential intelligence officers or intelligence informers. It's so public intellectuals and politicians, there has to be some consensus. It is all work. It's much easier for us not to do work. It's much easier for us to get together and talk about how horrible Russia is, how horrible Putin is, and everybody thinks the same. Wonderful meeting. Bye. I'll see you in another week, and we'll talk about exactly the same. So what I'm proposing takes a lot of work, a lot of grant writing, a lot of convincing, a lot of knocking on doors. And conversations with senators. There was a meeting in November last year with one of the senior Russian analysts that, I helped arrange with one of the senior American senators. And this very senior US senator said to us, there are several of us, at her home, and she said, how come not one senior Russian analyst or politician ever came to my office? I was struck by that question. She said, well, why come to my office? I want to talk about it some more. My office in Washington, D.C. So there's something that's missing. We are not doing the work, of convincing our policymakers that such thing is necessary, that this funding is necessary, that, helping build this community of Russia watchers of the 21st century is necessary. That's what I'm always looking at practical things, but learning the language well, understanding the language, and arranging opportunities of not just students, and not to be afraid. Fear is somehow runs ahead of us. Fear to be labeled, fear not to be invited, fear not to be, published. But this is why we need to build communities of intellectuals who are not afraid. And that only comes, if in classroom, students know that it's normal. It's normal to study, to converse, to debate, to question, to ask those who think differently. And that's what's not happening.
Other reactions?
Well, I would say, the first thing is that, we need to cultivate an awareness, a cynical awareness, if you will, throughout think tanks, sections of academia related to this, government, that knowledge is power. And if we lack, not just in the intelligence sense, the work of the CIA, but or the State Department or the DIA, but in our system as a whole, if we lack knowledge of another country, we will lack the basis for intelligent and successful policies. We have a duty. I'm not a servant of the state, but if I were, I would say as a servant of the state or as a member of think tanks, which do have this revolving door with the state and in a way see themselves as part of the state, it should be seen as part of their fundamental mission to study other countries. And if that requires a degree of moral courage, well, you have to cultivate that as well. Certainly, if you're going to preach to other countries about moral courage, you shouldn't, show yourself lacking in it yourself. The other thing I would say about American exceptionalism is, well, sorry, I keep referring to them, but Hans Morgenthau and Reinhold Niebuhr wrote about this, repeatedly. The difference between, on the one hand, having a real sense of moral principles of your own and a commitment to the defense of your democratic and open society, on the one hand, but on the other hand, an honest awareness that when it comes to not just how policy is conducted by your country and your elites in a given part of the world, I'm speaking here for Britain, my God, as well as America, in the Middle East, for example, not just how it is conducted, but most probably how it must be conducted, how it has to be conducted, that these are two very different things. And I think one does have to separate these, because on the one hand, we have to be committed to the principles of our democratic, liberal and open societies, genuinely committed to them as citizens. But we also have to recognize that, if one tries to say to a Russian or a Chinese or anybody else for that matter, that our policies in the Middle East, for example, have always and necessarily been based on those principles, they will laugh at us. You simply can't have an honest discussion with people on that basis. And when you recognize that in the world of actual policy, we are in effect all sinners to a greater or lesser extent, that is then the basis for talking with representatives of other countries about their policies and our policies in given parts of the world, without starting from the standpoint that we are good and innocent and they are evil and misguided. Because I would have to say that, in the Middle East, or the greater Middle East, as far as outside powers are concerned, given their role over the generations, nobody is innocent, nobody.
I would like to just pick up on that point for a moment in terms of how to puncture American exceptionalism. That will always be a part of our domestic politics, and that is how it is. But for people who want to be serious about foreign policy, American exceptionalism can be a kind of poison. So I would say the antidote, it sort of echoes what Anatol has said a moment ago in the sort of moral language, we're all sinners. But to continue with that, we didn't create the Garden of Eden in 1945. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. We created the rules-based order in 1945, and it's been working wonderfully for 75 years. And only in the last 2 or 3 years have sort of problems emerged on the horizon. I mean, that's remarkable historical nonsense. I mean, Korean War was extremely tough. Vietnam War was, in many respects, a catastrophe for the United States. Of course, the Iraq War is the more salient example because it's the more recent one. But you study those examples, not to lose faith in American foreign policy. You can still accomplish a lot of good things, but to learn what it's been and to have a sort of balanced sense of what's possible and impossible. And indeed, as Anatol said, if you can acknowledge maybe certain mistakes in the past, that becomes a basis for conversation, or at least the beginnings of that with other countries that you accuse of making similar mistakes. It's I suppose easy to suggest that. I don't see it happening all that much around us, at least in the Washington, D.C. world.
Well, Keith, let me give you the last word on all of this, since we are rapidly approaching the witching hour for this debate. Keith, go ahead.
Oh, I would just add to that. I mean, Anna earlier formulated one of the questions of the 21st century. Another is how we give up the empire, how the U.S. moves on from this dominant hegemonic position. It's very difficult to move on from the empire, from an empire. It's especially difficult when you never acknowledge that it was an empire. And one of the things that we might learn from the Russian experience is just how painful it is, and some of the things to avoid when you are forced into a more modest and humble position on the world stage. And there's a lot of danger ahead as far as that goes with regard to Russia and China and a host of other places. So I think that's kind of the overarching question facing our foreign policy thinking in the next decade or two, and it's there's a lot of danger there.
All right, well, thank you. I want to thank our panelists. I found this to be a fascinating, very insightful discussion that I hope will continue because I think we've got a lot of work to do to step up our game, to use an American sports metaphor. And I also want to thank our audience for a terrific set of questions. I apologize that we've not had the time to get to all of them, but I hope we can continue this discussion in the future and put into practice some of the suggestions that have come from this. I look forward to doing that. So again, thank you.
Great, thank you.